Good afternoon. Thank you again for joining the TK show, where we try to have interesting conversations, not just about where South Africa is and the rest of the continent, but where we would actually like to be ideally. And in today's presentation, I think, or let's say discussion, I think we've got a very interesting one. I think it's one of those institutions we always hear a lot about. It's Dr. John Endres, if I'm not mistaken. We always hear a bit about them, and it's almost as though you are a shadowy organization where people just bring you up and you're like, oh, they do exist. Forgetting that I think you're 94 years old, if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Endres.
Yeah, we've been around for a really long time, TK. We were founded in 1929 and have been involved in so much work over that time and started out really as an organization dedicated to figuring out what was going on in the country and especially tracking also race relations, which of course, even in 1929 weren't going that well, even though that was before apartheid. And then during apartheid, of course, things got a lot worse. The Institute was always there, researching, talking, speaking, writing about these things in the forefront of trying to highlight how things were going badly and what to do about it.
No, thanks for that. Yeah, today's conversation, I think, is a bit of a different one in the sense that I think we always hear a lot about, let's say, think tanks in South Africa. It's one of those spaces where it's very niche. If you know about it, you know about it. If you don't know about it, you get a bit of surprise. Say, oh, where do these guys come from? And I think maybe that's just a good place to start. Just the origins of the IRR, the Institute of Race Relations, and any linkages with the British Institute of Race Relations.
The British Institute of Race Relations has always been quite firm about distancing itself from us. I say always. Recently, it certainly has. But let me explain the origins of the South African version of the Institute of Race Relations. So we've been around for a really long time. We think, the oldest think tank in South Africa, and we're probably also the oldest liberal think tank or classically liberal think tank in the world. At least we've looked around. We haven't seen any that are older. And the way the Institute started off was through something called joint councils, where concerned citizens in different parts of the country got together to form councils, which were like discussion groups, mainly driven by people from academia and also from the religious organizations, faith-based organizations that sort of felt uneasy about developments in the country, wanted to figure out the details, and then did interviews, wrote reports, gathered statistics, just to understand what was going on. And the statistical part became very important from about 1948, when the Institute published something called the South Africa Survey, which is a compendium of data on South Africa that ranges from employment to demographics to trade statistics to crime. Any topic you can think of is covered in that publication. And that still gets published nowadays every single year. So if you want to know something about South Africa, you can find out from the Institute of Race Relations and from the SA survey.
No, that's quite interesting. And so from the origins, and I think probably we'll dovetail back to this a bit, is obviously when you say liberalism within the context of South Africa, I think automatically one does sort of think of Britain, and one does think of the United States. And the relationship, and yeah, maybe just if you can maybe expand a bit on when we say classical liberalism in South Africa vis-a-vis the UK or even the rest of Western Europe, are we speaking about the same thing or are there slight nuances here?
Yeah, there are plenty of nuances, and I think the name also changes over time. So it's a really broad tradition with many different streams, and I think particularly in the United States, it has taken quite a different direction, where some of the liberal thoughts that are quite popular in the United States are ones that we probably would not endorse, and that is why we use the prefix classical liberalism as opposed to just plain old liberalism to make it clear that we're talking about something else here. And one of the key points of distinction is that our tradition of liberalism is one that is non-racial and explicitly and radically non-racial. And we know that there's been quite a shift in the world recently in terms of critical race theory that takes a new interpretation of relationships between the races and what should be done to improve them. And that sometimes also includes racial discrimination. And that is something that the IRR stands against and has for a very, very long time. So we thought racial discrimination is not a good idea during the times of apartheid, and we think it's still not a good idea today. We think you should really treat individuals based on who they are, not based on which race they belong to.
No. Yeah, got an interesting one there. So just maybe following along that trajectory, then obviously there's always a link to say while you are a think tank, an independent think tank, the questions then do get asked about what then is a political expression. And I think here you kind of understand I'm going towards a political party which people usually associate you with. Has it always been the case? And I think we know to get to today as the Democratic Alliance, but obviously before that it was named something else. Just that relationship of where think tanks and political parties intersect. Is it basically mutual interests, or who's influencing who, so to speak?
I think the Institute of Race Relations has been put in various camps at different times, and has not always fitted comfortably into those camps. So I think even the relationship with the DA, which in today's South Africa is maybe the one that is of most interest to people, where they say, look, you can see that there's people from the DA who work at the IRR, or people from the IRR who work at the DA. It looks like there's a bit of a revolving door there. What's going on? And the background to that is that the IRR is really hardcore, classically liberal, and the most liberal party in South Africa is the DA. So you'll see a lot of overlap between the positions of these two organizations, and I think naturally quite a bit of affinity between them as well. But it isn't always like that. So to give you one example, both the DA and the IRR were funded by an organization called the Friedrich Naumann Foundation that I used to work for, which is also a liberal organization based out of Germany. And there was a period in the early 2010s when the IRR, based on its research, was able to point out that the ANC had been quite successful in terms of rolling out services, building 10 or 12 houses for each informal house that was built after 1994, providing access to water, to electricity, to education, to healthcare, to so many South Africans who've been deprived of these services. And that went a little bit counter to what I think the DA would have liked to have seen, because they said, are you not on the same side as us? Why are you supporting our political opponents in the ANC by saying how wonderful they are and how well they're doing? And I think this was one of those examples where, the IRR does what the IRR does and what it considers to be right. And sometimes it aligns with what political parties might say and see and do. And sometimes it doesn't. And that was one of those times where we saw a little bit of a split or a gulf emerge between our two organizations. Then we moved back closer together again. Then we moved apart. Then we moved together. Then we moved apart. So, these relationships develop over time. And I think from the IRR's perspective, the important thing for us is, are you pushing the kinds of policies and values that lead to better outcomes for South Africa, which we think are classically liberal positions, and it is not necessarily linked to any specific party. So if the ANC had a huge change of heart tomorrow and said, we're looking around us, we're seeing the devastation in the country, we don't like this, and we think we have to do something about it. We really need to change gear, change our orientation, and liberalize markets, embrace business investment, liberalize the labor markets as well, then the IRR would be first in line to cheer them on and say, well done, guys, let's get the growth going, let's get jobs created. That's what we need. And we don't actually worry too much about which party does that. It's really, the ideas that matter and the policies that matter.
Yeah, on that one, I know you're trained in Germany, so the idea of a political party having a think tank it really hasn't taken off in South Africa a lot. And you haven't lived in Germany. I found that it's actually a very nice counterplay, because sometimes political parties are busy with politics and they sometimes moonlight in the world of policy. Why have we not really seen that in South Africa? Because I remember in some of the earlier discussions, that was one of the advices that came from Germany, to say, basically encourage all political parties to set up think tanks who could critically analyze what they're doing and make an informed, data-based opinion. Why has this not really taken off in South Africa, where we do need, regardless of your political ideology, we do need conversations that are purely based on policy, even if it does have elements of politics?
Yeah, I think partly it's a question of resources. So another criticism or weakness that was pointed out in South Africa's political system is that most of the political parties don't really have researchers or research departments. Whereas in Germany, every single MP's got a researcher, the parties have got research departments and they're doing research all day long. So, they've got a lot of facts at their fingertips. When they produce policy positions, they've got departments dedicated to that. And that's a bit of a rarity, I think, in South Africa, just because there's not enough money to do that. You as a political party, you'll say, well, our resources are really limited. So are we going to pay some guys to produce charts, or are we going to rather print some posters and put them up on some street poles? At least we get elected. And that has been the calculus, I think, in the past that made a difference. I think we might be beginning to see a difference in South Africa coming out of the Political Party Funding Act, which has quite severely limited the ability of political parties to raise funding. And to such an extent, where we usually talk of the complaint of there being too much money in politics, I think there might be such a thing as too little money in politics. And maybe the Political Party Funding Act has created that kind of situation. So what we could see as a result of that is political parties creating think tanks, which are aligned with that party and which are able to raise funds and communicate political messages without being limited by the Political Party Funding Act. So that is a possibility we might see emerging in the future. I do not anticipate the IRR really being part of that, because we are independently funded. We raise our own funds, and we're not linked to any political party. So I think we do want to maintain that independence as well.
I think that's quite an interesting one, because if I'm not mistaken, in Germany's constitutionally, you need to have, each political party needs to have this. And I think it's always a question I've had is, look, if we do believe that, look, ideas do drive society for the positive or for the negative, that maybe rather than going down the electoral reform, we should have really said, look, let's start with basically allowing, obviously, as I said, all political parties at least have think tanks, which are, because I remember in the German cases, they are allowed to criticize if they feel as though the party is not going in a direction. And I think we could really do with that. Would you advocate for something like this, or are we going to go, I think what you've described sounds more a bit like the pack raising within the United States, where it's linked in a shadowy way to the political party, but you don't really know exactly where it begins and ends.
Yeah, we might get into that situation, which is like an unintended consequence of trying to create transparency in funding. You might end up with less rather than more transparency. In Germany, it's a special kind of situation because it's a result of the Second World War and the Nazi times, where after the war in West Germany, the Allies were very robust in denazifying the country. So they said, we can't let the Germans do something like this again. So we need to firstly get rid of the Nazi ideas and thoughts out of their heads. And secondly, we need to anchor democracy properly. So they created a federal agency called the Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung, or the Federal Agency for Political Education, or Civic Education, which sort of educates school children and people on the basic principles of democracy. How does parliament work? How do elections work? What's the role of the courts, et cetera, et cetera. So you create like this basic level of education on politics. But what they also did is that I think in the 1960s, it might have been 50s or 60s, they said, okay, we also realize that democracy doesn't mean that there's a single right solution to how to run a country. You may be a social democrat, or you could be a Christian conservative or liberal or whatever. There's different ways of looking at these things. So what we're going to do is we're going to use some federal funding from the government, which we're going to share out in proportion to the seats that each party holds in parliament. And that money can be used to set up a linked organization, which is not exactly a think tank, but it's actually a democracy promoting organization. So the Friedrich Naumann Foundation is the liberal think tank, if you want to call it that, linked to the Liberal Party, that does democracy education in Germany and also outside of Germany. And they'll say, we think liberalism is the best way, so let's fund programs that are liberal in some way, as in civic education, as in, strategy consulting, in research, in those kinds of things in different countries of the world. But then the other parties have their own organizations that correspond to that. So there'll be a Christian conservative approach, a social democratic approach, a post-communist approach. So each flavor of democracy has its own think tank.
Yeah, I think that's actually quite a wonderful description. And so how do you relate with many of them? Because I know there's a lot of them. I think the Rosa Luxembourg organization, there's a lot of them in South Africa. So is that a welcome thing, or does it probably muddy the water more than anything else?
I think it is a welcome thing. I think that the resources are not really great enough to swing things the one way or the other. It would be concerning, I think, if these were foundations that can change elections, but I don't think they're really in a position to do that. Their resources are too small, fortunately. But I think they do play a helpful role in broadening horizons. So for example, they enable MPs to go to other countries to see how things are done there. I think several of these foundations have now given their partner parties, ranging from the DA and some others, I'm sure as well, the opportunity to go to other countries to see how coalitions work. So they'll say, okay, we'll take you over to the Netherlands, which has got a long tradition of coalition governments. We'll take you to Germany and we'll look at how they do it. Because South Africa is going to have coalition governments in the future, lots of them. So we'd better figure out how to make them work. And we can assist with that. We can show you how it's done in other places.
So how would we grade that education if we look at the current mess that is coalition governments then?
Yes. Well, I think, in South Africa, it's been messy, but I think it is also a steep learning curve, and it's not an easy thing. So we shouldn't underestimate it and say, just because it's been pretty smooth under the ANC with its strong majorities for the past 30 years, it's going to be easy going forward. It won't be. We are a very diverse nation. We've got many different ideas about how things should be done. We've got so many different interests, and they are going to be in conflict sometimes. And making coalitions work means finding a way to express those differences, to reconcile those differences, to accommodate those differences. It's very tough, but we're capable of learning. And I think in many municipalities in South Africa, coalitions have worked well. But of course, our attention is drawn to those where it hasn't worked. So we love looking at Johannesburg and Tshwane and Ekurhuleni and Nelson Mandela Bay because it's so exciting. There's a new mayor every week, and there's always conflict and fights and betrayals and backstabbing and new negotiations, etc., etc. The horse trading, it's very exciting. But ultimately, in many places, it has worked, and it's all part of the learning experience that leads us to South Africa's future, which is going to be a coalition future.
No, that's quite interesting one, the fact that there are places where it works. So I guess my next question then in line with that, since you're in the business of ideas, I believe the slogan for the IR has to do with power of ideas, if I'm not mistaken. Where would you say South Africa is on just a thought spectrum? Do we too quickly just basically fall into let's say a tribal nature of politics, that I am this color, you are that color? By color I mean political party, not necessarily race. But the idea of what's the big thoughts, as in, do we have those big thoughts in South Africa about, listen, when we speak about societal change and the economy, do we actually put a lot of muster into this? So I'm trying to maybe get you to assess where political parties are on the idea of, thought-changing ideas about where South Africa should be. Because I think everybody agrees, look, it's crisis, but crisis could also be language for, look, we had poor ideas going into this and they're not playing out. What comes next? So where are we on the spectrum of ideas that can actually shift society forward?
Well, I think that there's something really interesting going on at the moment, which is that we are seeing in some ways a disconnect between the ideas held by leaders in politics and society and ideas held by ordinary South Africans. And I think ultimately that's going to play out if South Africa remains open, free and democratic like it is at the moment, in a turning away from the current governing party, because its ideas do not align with the ideas held by most ordinary South Africans. So we do opinion polling and we ask people various things about, relationship between the races, but we also ask about priorities. And we say, if you had to pick the top 2 problems in South Africa that need to be solved, what do you think? What do you think they are? And people can say what they think the 2 biggest problems are. And we've been doing these polls for 15 or maybe 20 years. And the top issue every single time is the same one. It's jobs and unemployment. So that's like the top concern of people, bar none. It's always ranked at the top. Then as you go down the list of other issues that get mentioned, you'll see there's 2 groups that come following on that top ranked issue. And the one group is related to service delivery. So it'll be like load shedding, it'll be education, it'll be housing, it'll be water, it'll be roads, be transport, all of those things. And the second group is issues related to law enforcement. So it'll be like worries about crime, worries about corruption. And what this tells us is that most South Africans are really driven by very sensible middle-of-the-road concerns that they would like to see addressed and that they feel are not being addressed at the moment. We're sitting with our 32.9% unemployment rate. It was completely insane. Almost 8 million people without jobs. And this is the main concern of people. Why is this not being fixed? Why is the party not going there and saying, okay, this what we're doing now isn't working. Unemployment just keeps going up. We can't continue doing this. This is terrible. We've got to turn that around. And that's not well sold at the moment by the party in government. They can't convincingly say that they're going to fix that problem. They've had 30 years and things just keep getting worse. The same applies to all the other priority issues. So your roof is leaking. When you open your tap, the water that comes out gives you cholera. When you flick the switch on your wall, the lights don't come on because you're currently in stage whatever load shedding. When you walk home from work or from school, you get mugged. The politicians are corrupt, and none of this is satisfactory. Then you keep going down the list, and you come right to the bottom of the list, and you'll see all of those issues that occupy so much space in our political discourse are right at the bottom of that list. And that includes issues like racism, inequality, land reform, redistribution, those kinds of issues. So we're not saying that those issues don't matter. People do care about those things, but the weight of the major concerns is so dominating at the top of that list that it completely outweighs the concerns at the bottom of the list.
If then this is the case, as you've just highlighted, why then is it so hard to focus on unemployment? Because you would think, like, even from a selfish perspective, if you're a political party, if you're able to solve that basically buys you decades in power.
Yes,
exactly. Why? Right. So I've got a colleague who asked the question: is it deliberate or is it incompetence?
Really tough question. And we used to harbor the hope that we would be able to make an argument out of self-interest to the ANC, where we could say to the ANC, look, guys, we could show you by the numbers. When your performance is good, your support goes up. You guys touched 70% support almost in the 2004 elections. And that was on the back of 3.6% annual average growth. You added 20,000 rand to GDP per capita. You increased electricity output by almost 50%. You built houses, you provided water access, electricity, etc., etc. All of these successes are real, and you got rewarded for that. As a matter of fact, Thabo Mbeki got a higher share of the vote than even Nelson Mandela did. Nelson Mandela, like the great iconic statesman, the man who led us to freedom, the charismatic, great leader, wasn't able to get 70%. But Thabo Mbeki was. And why? Because you were succeeding. You're getting things right. Since then, you've been going down on all the measures. Since about 2008, we look at the statistics, everything is getting worse, and support for the ANC is getting worse. So we made the argument to the ANC. We said, guys, if you want to get back to your glory times, you've got to sort this out, because if you don't, you're going to keep dropping. But today, we think that it might not be possible to do that. And we read all the ANC's policy documents. We follow the policy conference, follow the elective conference. We read Umrabulo, the newsletters, to see what the state of mind of the ANC is. We can see the concern rising. We can see Fikile Mbalula a week or two ago saying, when I see the ANC polling at 49, 50%, I'm shocked. And you're like, okay, this is like Secretary General, so he wants them to be at 70%, quite right. And he says, I'm shocked because we should be at 30%. And you're like, oh, is that right? Okay, so you can see you're worried. So what are you doing about it? But then you read the policy documents and you do not see reforms. You see continuing right along the same policy path that we're on, that we've been on for the past 15 years, that has brought us to where we are now. And we are still walking in that direction. And it can only end one way, which is going to be in the demise of the ANC. If they don't turn around, they're going to disappear one day. They'll be like the NP was, the colossus of South African politics, white politics, up to 1994, eventually absorbed into the ANC, with the deputy tourism minister in the cabinet, and then disbanded a few years later and gone without a trace. And the ANC is going to sink itself the same way if it doesn't figure out how to fix these problems. Now, I think it's beginning to realize that, but why can't it do it? And the reason it can't do it, I think, is because of the dominant ideas within the party, which are very much still inspired by outdated ideology dating back to the 1960s and the East Bloc. Communist Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union inspired many of the strategies, the politics, the policies of the ANC during that time, and the ANC hasn't quite managed to let go of that. We have a book coming out written by my senior colleague, Anthea Jeffrey, next month on the National Democratic Revolution, which is like the shorthand for the path to socialism and then eventually communism in South Africa. That's, as much as anything can be said to inspire policy and thinking about the state of the country, it seems to be that. And that really is very misguided. It's not going to work. If you want to make this place grow, you've got to deracialize labor markets. You've got to deracialize procurement. You've got to let the SOEs perform on their own merits. You can't pursue societal goals or socially engineer society when the economy is going down, when unemployment is going up. You've got to get the economy growing first, and for that you've got to shed some of your most cherished ideas, and that's very hard to do.
But on that one, though, one could make the argument you are ascribing a certain logic of philosophy to the ANC when you speak about socialism. But as you said, when the ANC has worked best, President Thabo Mbeki was a pragmatist. Maybe the time made for pragmatism, but just on that, when I said, is it purposeful? Because I think we all read the ANC policy documents, but in reality, what's in policy, whether it's God sent or not, hardly ever translates into government. There's almost this lag which doesn't happen. So that's why I'm asking, is it really deliberate, or is it simply it's by happen chance that whoever happens to have a certain administrator given time and point is allowed to do what they want, especially, as you said, over the last 15 years? Or it's more, it's less a residue of design and more happenstance. Would you buy that, or do you really believe they believe wholeheartedly in the NDR and this is how they've set their mind to it?
I think this is a very justified question, and you're quite right to ask it. We were asked it at a conference I was on the weekend, where somebody also said, are you guys being serious saying this? Because, you sort of look at the cabinet and you see quite a lot of incompetence around, and you say they've got this huge conspiracy theory dating back decades, extending into the present, guiding their thinking, and they're sort of pursuing this without anybody noticing. Surely, that can't be right. Surely, given who's leading us. And I think the truth is that to explain many of our outcomes in South Africa, you have to look at a combination of three factors. And this is very harsh, what I'm going to say now. But if you want to understand why we see the policies and the outcomes that we observe in South Africa, I think you have to look at the ideology firstly. But secondly, you have to look at competence. And thirdly, you have to look at integrity. And I think this is like three strands that you weave together to make a plait, and that explain the way in which our country is developing. And sometimes one of those strands predominates, and sometimes it's a different one of those strands that predominates. Sometimes incompetence leads to the results that we see. Sometimes corruption and lack of integrity leads to the results that we see. But sometimes it's also the ideology. And I think because that is sort of an underestimated component of that, it is worth drawing attention to that and say, well, okay, now everybody agrees that there's a problem with the competence, there's a problem with the integrity, but there is actually another aspect to this. And so that is what this book is going to do. It will say, okay, we realize there are three strands, but we're going to focus on this one strand because we want to explain how that plays into the outcomes that we are seeing. And then what you notice is, I think that when the ANC is looking for orientation and is looking for a way to organize its thinking, its mental reference point is going to be the NDR. So it's not like they're reading it every single day and sort of praying to the manual, but they'll say, okay, we've got to make a decision about land reform. Where do we take our guidance from? Okay, let's go back to the National Democratic Revolution. Or if we want to figure out a policy on redistribution, where do we take our guidance from? What do we think about? Okay, it's probably something related to National Democratic Revolution. And I think that's where we see it in the policies sometimes, where there's quite an emphasis on state intervention, redistribution, and social engineering. And that comes out of that philosophy.
Now, just on that, I think we just want to move towards, because I think you've described the political party, you've described the arena of where think tanks are, or I think most importantly, where the IRR is. Just on the question of society, are South Africans naturally liberal? Because I think speaking to colleagues from other countries, the argument they make is South Africans are socially conservative, but when it comes to the economy, they are open to the ideas of the market having a big role. And I think it's one of those things when no one wants to live in a collective, in a farming collective, so to speak, like they did in the USSR. People are for commerce. It's just the like you said, the flavor of commerce that comes up there. So maybe if we can just tackle that, just are South Africans actually liberal, or are liberal to certain things?
I think they are to some extent liberal and to some extent conservative, but probably more so these two things than socialist or communist, if I can put it that way. And the first observation here was that there was a very prominent social scientist who I would have loved to meet, but I never got the opportunity, called Laurie Schlemmer. And he was he did surveys, opinion polling, and so on. And in the mid-90s, he said that if you do an opinion survey amongst South Africans, and there are some white respondents in that group and some black respondents in that group, if you remove the race information out of the poll, you're not going to be able to distinguish between the two. Because in terms of attitudes and values, their thoughts about the family, about the role of religion, about responsibility are pretty much identical. So that I thought that was really interesting. So that is something that South Africans have in common. So I think that conservative aspect is there. I think it is quite strong, as a matter of fact. The liberal aspect, to my view, comes out of our history, where you think of pre-1994, where you couldn't choose what work you did, you couldn't choose where to live, you couldn't choose who to marry, you couldn't choose where to get educated in South Africa. All of that was racially separated by the government. And so after 1994, that changed, and now you are able to marry who you choose, you can work whatever you like, you can move wherever you like, you can ascend in your profession as far as you like, there's no limitations, which is the way it's meant to be. And I think that is a freedom that South Africans are going to be unwilling to give up. So when I see, the ANC's flirtations with China, for example, which is very repressed society, my hope is that South Africans are not really keen on that sort of thing, because they've been through it already. They've already had a government telling them where they could live, who they could marry, what work they could do, etc., etc. They don't want to go back to that. So South Africans, in that sense, I think, have been liberated, and I think they've drunk that spirit of freedom, and they do not want to give that up again.
No, thanks for that, John. Again, for those who have just joined us, welcome to the TK Show. We're speaking to Dr. John Endres from the IRR, going through the spectrum of think tanks, their history, what they mean, and also just touching on society and political parties. Just on the last point you made, that South Africans have drunk, I think, the idea of freedom. But I think there's also, I've got a colleague who says, if you look at how COVID, the restrictions were rolled out, he says something interesting. He says, what's actually missing is if South Africa had a proper, I don't want to say a demigod, because I think sometimes that has a negative connotation, because it misses what you've said, people's yearning for something that works. But he said, if you actually had an individual, let's, I think, play a bit of putting, I think you would have played this game, I'm not sure if you're a fan of football, but there's a game called FIFA. You get to choose your favorite side. But if you had to take someone who has a bit of the charisma of former President Jacob Zuma, and a bit of Julius Malema to him, someone who has the ability to seem, and I use the word seem, to speak to the private sector in the form of President Cyril Ramaphosa, somebody who has a bit of the intellect of President, you see where I'm going, President Mbeki, and somebody who has a bit of elements of a Freedom Front Plus in terms of this is how we're conservative, the SADP, and you actually have to put this individual together who is untarnished by the 3 decades of what's happened, but is simply responding to say, listen, South Africans, we have tried your game. We have tried to say, listen, everybody going to elections kind of has an idea of rationality when they vote. We know that's not true. Give me the chance of a decade. I think the Romans used to use the term a dictator, which I think we kind of use it sparingly. I don't think we understand the origins, which is in times of crisis, you would call on this dictator to come through. Are you saying that's totally out of the realms of possibility in a country like South Africa, where personalities, as a country descends, the idea of personality ascends? Am I on something there, or you think never will happen here?
Yeah, I think it could. And you see in public commentary sometimes this desire for a savior coming through. So I think there's a bit of a savior complex about us, where we say we just need somebody to save us from this mess that we're in, and we're willing to give up our freedoms just to get some order back in our lives and some growth, etc., etc. And that concerns me because I think that it is dangerous. This idea of the benign or benevolent dictator who takes charge and produces good results is very beguiling, but also very misleading, because mostly what you get is then not a benevolent dictator, but a bad one. Once you hand over your power to this guy or girl or woman, you might hope that it's going to be a Lee Kuan Yew or, some sort of leader who's really, really great, and you get the growth, et cetera, et cetera. But what you end up with is going to be a mess. So rather don't do that. And I also think that in South Africa, because we are such a diverse society, it is quite difficult for one person to capture the state like that. There are so many centers of power in South Africa, ranging from ethnic ones to regional ones, to racial ones, to economic ones, that for one person to be able to bring all of this together under one umbrella is going to be very tough. And I think that's a strength, actually, of South Africa's, that we can say we are an unruly nation, and we are a difficult to manage nation, and we are messy as a result of it. But that is also a strength, because it protects us from the dictator, from the autocrat that takes away our freedoms and probably leaves us worse off than we are now.
Yeah, so on that, now if we were to follow that trajectory and go back to what you said, that look, the ANC has sort of put themselves into a difficult position, which would culminate in what you're saying, that look, they could go and dip below 50. Then comes the question, and I think it's not always a fair question, but I think we have to play with it, which is, and people ask, what comes next? And what does next look like? And I've always made this argument for the ANC that, look, I know you've described the different poles of society, but the ANC is still probably one of the few, if not the only party, that is comfortable in the private sector with sending its individuals there to sit on boards. And there are many. They're able to sit down with many rural leaders, chiefs and kings and queens. They're able to, float the line between being a leftist party and at the same time cajoling the private sector to say, no, we're just joking, this is just to get things done. So looking at what the ANC, that spectrum, what they say is a broad shade, it has been an advantage to them. Do you see a DA, an IFP, an EFF being able to straddle those different sectors of society? Because in a way, what's made the ANC a bit tough, like you said, you almost need a great leader who holds it together. And if they're unable to, create its own problem. So what comes next? And do political, like you said, maybe coalitions allows you to straddle that, but is that what people naturally want?
I think that there's a way of looking at the ANC where you consider the ANC to be a coalition in one party. Because, we look at the ANC, we think it's like this one massive party, monolithic, with, a mind of its own, a vision of its own. But ultimately, it unites within one party so many different streams, ranging from the left to the right, from the people with high integrity to people with slightly less integrity. And it's been very successful managing that coalition within one party. But South Africa's history, I think, has also been dominated by single organizations calling the shots across the whole landmass. So you'd have the NP from 1948 for 40, whatever it is, 4 years, calling the shots, 46 years, being in power and making decisions on behalf of all South Africans from the perspective of a single party. And the ANC has been in somewhat the same position of being a single entity in control of events. That, I think, is not going to be South Africa's future. I think South Africa's future is going to be one where you'll have multiple parties contesting ideas, contesting power, and reflecting the aspirations and hopes of different groups. And that also, I think, is a healthy thing, because in a country that is as diverse as South Africa, it's probably not a good thing for one group to be calling the shots all the time. You actually do want political contestation to occur, and you want political power to be distributed across various organizations. So that is, I think, what the future holds. I think 2024 is only going to be the first step on that journey. So it may well be that the ANC retains a majority, or that it is able to stay in power as part of a coalition itself. But the path towards the future is going to be one of coalitions where there probably won't be a single party that is, never mind 50%, but even as large as 35 or 40%. And the past 30 years, I think, have been an anomaly rather than the rule for South Africa's history going forward. Got a proportional representation system. We've got lots of different interests, and I think that needs to be reflected in a really broad spectrum of parties in South Africa, and that's what we're going to get.
No, it's interesting. I'm actually just trying to look up a book I've been trying to get my hands on. It's from Tory Nation by Samuel Earle, who makes the argument that, look, parties that win, and I think the Conservative Party is the most successful political party in the world in terms of how many times have won election. But he mentioned something which really did, when I read it, I'm like, oh, the ANC kind of, this basically been stuck in the gaze of the Tory party, which is even the current, I think, the leader of Labour. He almost needs to come across as being a better version of a Tory, not a classical Labour individual. I sometimes think, is that not maybe the case with many of our opposition parties, that they're almost trying to say we can be a better version of the ANC, give or take a few ideological twists and turns. And I always find that to be a bit of a difficult thing to say. If you want to be a better version of the ANC,
yes,
how does this work out for, how are you going to do that? Because like you said, the ANC is much like the National Party, it's a unique set of circumstances which, look, I think for the negative or positive, both these political parties had people, obviously the National Party will never say morally correct leaders, but thinkers, the ANC thinkers. And I never quite get the feeling among opposition parties that they are able to get out of the gaze of the ANC in the same way the Labour Party struggles with it. Does it count, or is it two different points in South Africa?
No, I think you're right about that. I think also the ANC is very good at being the ANC, and that makes it very difficult for somebody else to be good at being the ANC. So I think that's not necessarily a winning proposition for opposition parties to identify themselves in terms of the ANC. But the ANC has been so dominant in our political system for so many years that it's very difficult to imagine a different kind of constellations in the political sphere. And you can see political parties battling with that. Their language, I think, is still very much the language that is set by the ANC. Many of their policies and thoughts revolve around the things that the ANC has done and created over the past 30 years. And parties do find it difficult to formulate their own identity without reference to the ANC. And even the DA, as the largest opposition party, I think has been guilty of this in the past, where they define themselves as the opposition to the ANC rather than being the DA on its own merits. And when they try to do it, they also catch a lot of flack for it. And people would say, why are you moving in this crazy direction? I don't know what you're doing there. Because my mind frame is very much set in the ANC worldview. And so I don't understand what the ANC, what the DA is doing then, that, they're talking about non-racialism and about, their replacement policy for BEE, et cetera, et cetera. That makes no sense at all. Surely we must do what the ANC has been doing, just do it better.
Yes.
Yes.
You just do it better.
Just do it better, yes. And you literally hear this, right? You say, no, BE's been great, except that it's been badly implemented. We just need to refine it until it works. And I don't think it will. I think it's a little bit like communism itself. When you argue with communists, you say, but guys, communism collapsed in 1990, so why are you still pushing it? And then they'll say, well, but real communism has never been tried. It's only been at a cost of 100 million lives so far, but maybe we should have a few more goes. Maybe we'll figure it out.
No, it's an interesting take, that one, because I remember speaking to a few, because one's work does look at China, and I do find that the Chinese Communist parties are fascinating. As a political party, it is fascinating. It's highly scientific, very ruthless, obviously, like all political parties. And I remember speaking to a few of the officials, and they said something quite interesting. They're like, we actually told the SACP that communism does not exist. It doesn't work, because they saw the brunt of it. And they said, listen, what you need to focus on is the market. Now, what the other elements you speak about, how you view society, how you engineer society, obviously that one might argue that has elements of socialism. But what they were saying is, what surprises them that the SACP and parts of the ANC actually seem to believe what you've just said, that this thing could work, give or take.
Yeah.
So just on that, is it that maybe thought-wise, people are not open to them? Because that's my next way of pivoting, is, are South African parties, in terms of ideology, are we not open to what's happening in the rest of the world, and therefore we want to learn, but obviously contextualize?
I think we are open, and I think we're also subject to influences from outside South Africa. And that's not a bad thing. It's cross-pollination. You get pollination with good ideas, you get pollination with bad ideas. Sometimes you look at the right country, but you draw the wrong lessons. And I think China is an example there, where South Africa's leadership looks longingly towards China and says, there's like a 7-8% economic growth rate over decades. Look what they achieved and how many millions of people they lifted out of poverty. That's what we should be doing. But what enabled that was effectively the liberalization of the economy. It was the stepping away from communism after 1978, the pro-market reforms, particularly the special economic zones. All of that growth, all of that investment and that tremendous upliftment was driven out of those areas which was precisely where communism was least applied. And in the areas where it was still applied, so the rural areas and the hinterland are still underdeveloped. So the lesson you should learn from looking at China is actually that it's the deregulation that works. It's the liberalization that works. That's what you've got to be looking for. And I'm not sure that South Africa's government is doing that at the moment. Also quite worried to see Mbeki going on a fact-finding mission to China about law enforcement. And I'm like, okay, sure, we've got a crime problem, got to fix it. But on the other hand, China is the place with social credit system, with like the surveillance, the continuous monitoring of citizens. And I don't actually feel very comfortable with that. I think that's a terrible thing. And I don't think it's something South Africa should introduce by any means. That's a terrible thing to do here.
Yeah, I think it moves me to my third point, which is the South African Constitution, which, look, depending on how you speak, I'm of the view that, look, it served its purpose, and we now need to contextualize where we are to improve certain elements. How embedded is a South African Constitution in any future South Africa under any political party? Are we saying this is it? Or do you foresee a situation where people say, look, we might have to have a conversation about it being more reflective of wherever we are at a given moment in time?
I mean, that's kind of interesting, because we've seen some people in the ANC talk about the Constitution being the impediment to progress in South Africa. And we've seen some leaders say that we should move back to a parliamentary democracy, where parliament is the ultimate authority in the country and not some written document. But I'm not really seeing widespread support for that idea. I think South Africans quite like the Constitution. They're proud of having achieved it. It is a very progressive document, but also one that is a result of a compromise. So nobody's really happy about it, 100% happy about it. No, and so from my point of view, one of the concerns about the Constitution is the progressive realization of socioeconomic rights. So I think that the Constitution prescribes some benefits that are not properly costed, and that gets us into trouble sometimes. So when the courts say, well, you do actually have an obligation under the Constitution to provide healthcare services to everybody who's inside South Africa, no matter whether they're South Africans or not. That's very laudable. It's very nice. It's very humane, humanistic, generous to do so. But it's also expensive. And so when the provincial health ministers say, we've got a problem here, we realize that we've got this obligation, we've got this duty to supply services, we'll do it, but we actually haven't got the resources for it. You've got to send us more money, you've got to send us more doctors, more nurses if we've got to do this. Otherwise, everybody's going to come up short, which is currently the situation. There's not enough capacity. So the Constitution does create problems sometimes, which are a result of how it's set out. It is a compromise document, but I think on the whole, quite a good compromise. And it is, I think, quite strong on anchoring freedom-related rights, so to protect the individual against the state, which is the most important role of a constitution, is to do that, because the state can be so powerful.
No, thanks for that answer. I think as we move towards closure, then obviously you being in the space of a think tank, and obviously you do get to travel, you do get to speak to a lot of international partners. And yeah, I think the question everybody asks is, look, what are they saying? Because I always tend to find there's a lot of interest, even in Europe or even in America, about South Africa. And sometimes I think we always say South Africa does have a bit of an America complex without the finances to be able to foot the bill, so to speak. Americans can afford to be ignorant. We are a small economy. We should be more export orientated. That should be our number one thing. How do we export not just minerals, but basically things we can make? And yeah, I'm interested to see, what are people you've spoken to outside the borders of South Africa, whether on the continent or the rest of the world? What is they say? You say South Africa to them now. What do you get?
Well, I think the image that South Africa has internationally has, of course, changed over time. And for a very long time, it was dominated by the democratic transition. So if you spoke to the ordinary person in the street in Europe or America, and you said South Africa, what do you think of if I say South Africa? They would know Mandela, they would know apartheid, and sometimes that was about as much as they knew. And then for quite a long period, South Africa increasingly dropped off the radar, and you'd say South Africa, people wouldn't know what you're talking about. But now South Africa is getting back onto the radar, unfortunately not in a good way. So one of the things that is making headlines is load shedding, where, the world's press is waking up to the fact, we know we've had it for 16 years. 16 years, I think. But the rest of the world doesn't know that. They think load shedding is a new thing. And they say, how do you manage? How do you cope? And we thought South Africa was like this only industrialized economy in Africa, quite developed, quite sophisticated. But now, you guys can't keep the lights on. What's going on? So they can't quite understand what's happening there. And the second thing that's putting us on the global map is our position on Russia, where today we saw a bipartisan letter from American politicians writing to the Secretary of State and saying, you really need to look at South Africa's benefiting from the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, which is a law that gives South Africa duty-free access to the American market for our exports. That's a really valuable thing to have. And they're saying, why does South Africa have this privilege, given that it's quite highly developed, but also that it's not really acting in alignment with America's foreign policy interests? So there's like shipping of arms to Russia, there's participating in naval exercises with Russia, there's opening military airports to Russian transport aircraft coming in. What's going on there? Are you on our side or not? And if you're not, then why are we giving you this benefit? And that is, I think, creating increasing interest in the United States, especially, where for a long time South Africa really wasn't relevant, wasn't really important. I think those governments indulged the South African government and sort of didn't really care too much about what we said or did. But now they're beginning to care. And the last thing you want to do as a relatively small country in the world is to attract the attention of the American Congress, the US Congress. Because once they get you in their sights and start taking aim at you, they can make life very unpleasant for you. So I'm a little bit worried about that. We saw the South African Reserve Bank also in its financial stability review writing about the risk of secondary sanctions, where primary sanctions are on Russia, for example, for its involvement in the Ukraine war. Secondary sanctions would mean, well, you're dealing with a country that is under primary sanctions like Russia, you're supporting that country, so we're going to put some sanctions on you as well. And this, again, is a flashback to apartheid, It's like going back to the 1980s where South Africa was sanctioned and had race-based policies all over the place. And now we're back to that. That's not a great feeling. So I'm hoping that our political processes can engineer a way out of this, where we say that we're not in a place where we want to be. As a country, it's a proud nation, South Africa, with great aspirations and great hopes for the future. And at the moment, we're stuck in no growth, high joblessness, and the peak of our aspirations is a 350 Rand grant. Is that really as good as it gets? And that's actually not very good. So we need to get out of this, and we need a vision for the future where we say, no, we want to compete with the best in the world. We want to be amongst the best in the world on our own merits, and get the economy growing, get jobs being created, and find a proud place in the world, which we haven't got at the moment.
No, thanks for that. Just on that one, before I think I get to my final question, is that not maybe a symptom of the international world is changing? America has changed. I think you'd be familiar with the Thucydides' trap, which is South Africa just happened, like you say, we happen to be in the gaze of an America, which is a bit, look, I think truth be said, they are also a bit sensitive about the fact that people are not necessarily, how do I put it? The world is moving. And they're also willing to accept that, listen, America, I call it, is the world's becoming more flat. And America has to accept that it's part of the world. Obviously, it'll always be a major player. So is that not maybe also an issue of America's sensitivity to the fact that they're changing? And I think you seem to see that a lot within the Republican Party, where they have a vision of greatness, but they refuse to accept that, look, other countries can also rise. They might not be liberal, they might not be democratic, but they have the right to rise. And how would you then advise a South African, whichever government, to say, listen, I think we need to keep all our ports open to all parties. including the Russians, including the Americans. So how do you navigate that? Because I think that is almost taking us back to Cold War. And the countries that did well, like your Singapores, were able to navigate those tensions. How do you advise that so that you don't become seen as how do you put it, hostile to one only? Yeah.
So I think my greatest concern at the moment is that South Africa is just unprepared and not thinking these things through properly. It seems to me that we're being caught flat-footed quite often by international developments, which take us by surprise, and then we have to scramble to find a justification, an explanation, an excuse, or whatever to explain how we got to where we are. And that should not be happening. So a good foreign service should be aware of trends. It should be strategizing about which position is desirable, which is not, and how to get to that position. And we don't seem to be doing that basic homework at the moment. I think the global trend is much as you say. So we are coming out of what was effectively a unipolar world. There was only one superpower in the world, which was the United States. We're transitioning now into what the Russians, for example, think is going to be a multipolar world. So they think, there'll be China, there'll be Russia, there'll be India, there'll be Brazil, there'll be United States, all competing. I'm not sure that is right, because I think what's actually happening is sort of a return to a bipolar world, where the one side is led by the United States and the other side is led by China, and various allies fall in line behind these huge superpowers. Not being aligned with either of them is going to be a very difficult act to pull off. You can try sit on the fence, but it's a precarious position to be in. And to do it successfully, you have to be really well informed, well prepared, and strategically astute. The worst thing you can do is to try to sit on the fence without being prepared for sitting on the fence, because then you're going to fall off. You don't know which direction, but it's going to be painful when you fall off. And that is the risk I see for us at the moment. If I had to make a call, whether it can be done, whether it should be done, I don't know if it can be done well, because the Americans are going to be insistent. They're going to say, South Africans, we're not actually going to let you get by with saying that you're non-aligned. We want you to make a call. You've got to say whose side you're on. You're either with us or you're against us. The Chinese might well do the same. They'll say, well, we also don't really feel comfortable with this position of studied neutrality or ambiguity. I want to figure out where, if the chips are down, who you're going to help. And at the moment, we're not doing that in a well-prepared way, I think.
Oh, no, thanks.
It's a dangerous position to be in.
Yeah, and I've always said my wish is that we become a Switzerland. Well, I think as well off as the Swiss, profiting from both sides, but you're saying it requires a special type of leadership.
And even the Swiss, I think even the Russians, I think, don't accept Swiss neutrality in the current international climate, because they see the Swiss as being aligned with Ukraine. So even for a nation like Switzerland, which has got this long-standing reputation of being neutral for decades, it's known for it. Even that is not accepted by one of the sides, and so it really is tough.
No, thank you for that. I think as we close off, now you are Dr. Endres. You've been called into the presidency, given a wish list, because I think it's always good to have conversations that also say, look, it is possible to get out of a quagmire. It won't be easy, but it is possible, because I think the job of think tanks is sometimes to give us a bit of foresight in terms of what is possible. So you've been given the policy wand, your treasury, the president is actually listening and doing stuff. Three things you say, listen, addresses the core issues which you brought up, which is unemployment, institutional degradation, and the like. Just, your three things which we could do in the short to long-term horizon, which really do make an impact to the everyday South African who's struggling.
Okay. So I'd say that all of my policy recommendations would be aimed at a single goal, which is to get the economy growing as quickly as possible and as fast as possible. And anything that we're doing at the moment that is preventing that from happening, we've got to stop doing. And that would include things like expropriation without compensation. I think you can't get investment if you haven't got secure property rights. I think you also need to deregulate the labor market and say, we need to allow businesses and SOEs and the public sector to appoint on the basis of merit. We can't have competing goals in appointments, and the same in public procurement as well. You've got to allow the SOEs to procure on the basis of value for money and use that as a priority. as Chief Justice Raymond Zondo said in his report from the Zondo Commission. He said at the moment the Constitution has got these competing priorities. It says on the one hand, it's redress for the past. On the other hand, it's value for money. Sometimes those two things conflict. You've got to choose which one is your top priority. And at the moment, we're just not making that choice. We're just creating uncertainty and little value for money. So we've got to pick one. And the one we should be picking is value for money. We have to make sure that when there's budget to tar a road to the village out in the rural areas somewhere, your choice is either to appoint a company that will tar the road all the way to the village, or to appoint a company that's fulfill some transformation objectives, but only gets halfway. And you've got to say, no, we need this road to go all the way. The transformation can't trump that, which is what's happening at the moment. So those would be two of my policy advices. Firstly, stop doing anything that undermines property rights. Secondly, deregulate the labor market. And thirdly, it would be really create an atmosphere that is conducive to investment. Our gross fixed capital formation rate is too low at the moment. It's at about 13%, should be at 25%. The reason for that is that investors don't feel welcome. They feel that their assets aren't safe and that their businesses can't prosper in this environment. Got to sort that out. Got to make investors feel that they are welcome, and then you've got a chance. And maybe as a closing remark, I do think that things can be turned around pretty quickly. We're in a really dark space at the moment as a nation. We're very gloomy. We're pessimistic. We're worried. We're anxious, with lots of reason to feel that way. But we've also got a lot of assets on our side, a lot of strengths on our side, which we can leverage. But we've got to create the conditions for these strengths to be unfolded and used to make the economy grow fast and the country grow. But it's doable. I do think it's doable.
Dr. John Endres from the Institute of Race Relations, thank you so much for, I think a part of your IR that doesn't come out a lot. I think in the sense that the optimism which you say, look, it is possible this country can be, as you said, a proper role player that's able to feed its citizens and the like. Thank you so much for your time. And all the best going forward, sir.
Thank you very much.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and rate us on all your preferred podcast platforms. If you'd like to find out more about what we're doing, please join our Substack community via the link in the comments below. And as always, we'd love to hear your suggestions for future guests and conversation topics.